Hello, everyone, and welcome back to We the World's live broadcast during this whole entire 11 days of their campaign. And today is the International Day of Peace. So I'm very honored and excited to be here sharing some of the work that we do and some of the visionary and solutionary work that's being done all over the country and around the world. My name is Rivera Sun. I am a novelist, actually. By first trade, I write peace-based novels like the Dandelion Insurrection and the award-winning Ari series. But I'm also an activist and an organizer, and I work on a number of different campaigns. But I also wear the hat of being Pache Ibene's program coordinator for Campaign Nonviolence and the Nonviolent Cities project. And Pache Ibene, which means peace, Pache, and Bene, which is good, peace and all good, is a 30-year-old nonviolence organization. It was started by Franciscans, but we now work secularly and across interfaith organizing practices. So in 30 years, we've trained tens of thousands of people. We've supported so many social justice campaigns. We've done amazing work. But in the last 8 years, we've launched something that has really grown and taken on almost a life of its own. And that is the Campaign Nonviolence Week of Actions. It started in 2014 as an annual week in September when we invited people to come together and to work together on a very broad-based platform, broad-based mission, and that was to build a culture of peace and active nonviolence, free from war, poverty, racism, and environmental destruction. As you can imagine, that's a tall order, right? That's a lot of places to work, but we see the issues, and increasingly we're not alone in this view. We see the issues as being connected, being entwined. And the way that we actually work with it is by understanding that many of the social justice issues that are present in our world are stemming from a similar place of a culture of violence and a culture of war. And so by looking at the commonalities and the similarities and the threads that connect between them all, we have been able to say increasingly over these 8 years, it's time to end the culture of violence. And it's time to transform that to a culture of peace and active nonviolence. And so today, with this We the World teach-in and live broadcast, we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, what that looks like, and what people are doing during Action Week. So thank you all for listening and being here with us. Many of you may be part of the Campaign Nonviolence Action Week already. Indeed, We the World's presentations are part of our Action Week. And we're honored to be part of the work that they do in a beautiful reciprocity between our organizations. I'm just going to share my screen just for a moment and bring up just a little bit of visual images as I talk to you about what's going on this week. The Campaign Nonviolence Action Week, as I mentioned, has been going on for 8 years. This is the largest year yet. We have over 4,391 actions happening this week. They are happening in all across the United States and around the world. And they range from people who are doing demonstrations for peace, or people who are teaching violence de-escalation. And, you know, one of the things that we're seeing is that people are endlessly creative about how they go about doing this. Some people are putting up giant bus ads promoting nonviolence on the side of city transit buses. Other people are having peace picnics in the park. Some people are doing daily teach-ins on social media or on webinars like this. If you want to take a Kingian nonviolence training this week, you could every single day of the week with a different group and organization. So I want to encourage you. I see Leo Jacoby put a comment about Laudato Si by Pope Francis into the chat box. please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box as we go along, and I'm happy to address them as I can. So don't be shy about that. I appreciate it. Just to talk a little bit more about what's happening during the Campaign Nonviolence Action Week, we've really started to work with groups in their local communities to identify what are the kinds of violence that are plaguing or troubling their communities. We're starting to increasingly recognize, and by we, I mean the world, is increasingly recognizing that violence is not just throwing punches or gun violence or, knife wounds. It's not just physical direct violence, but it's also systemic and structural violence, emotional, psychological violences, cultural violence. And these take the forms of things like mass incarceration is a form of systemic violence. Systemic racism is a form of systemic violence. Cultural violence may be something like excluding people and their practices from being part of an organization or being part of a celebration in your community. It may be banning certain practices that a culture upholds. We see this a lot around the treatment of Indigenous peoples all over the world, also in the United States. Structural violence is also things like environmental racism or pollution, right? So when people put up a factory in your neighborhood that puts out toxins, that's a form of violence to the people who live near it. The good news is that if we can have all these kinds of violences, we can also have all those kinds of nonviolence. So we can have systemic nonviolence, structural nonviolence, psychological and emotional nonviolence. We can have nonviolent communication. We can have cultural nonviolence and a culture of nonviolence. So these solutions may look something like restorative justice instead of a punitive justice system. It may be look like investing in peace building programs and hiring youth to be peace builders instead of only funding military job opportunities, right? So systemic, structural, and cultural nonviolence is kind of a big deal. It's ripe with opportunities all over the place. But what we find is that as we're doing this work, campaigning for a culture of peace and a culture of nonviolence, people give us blank looks. They don't really know what that means. And that's because we actually live in a culture of violence, that in our communities, in our schools and education, in the movies we watch, in the books that we read, we actually teach and train and practice violence. We've normalized so many forms of structural violence. And so campaign nonviolence seeks to challenge the centrality of the culture of violence in our culture and to assert an alternative. And that has to do a lot with looking at our solutions to our problems as forms of systemic or structural nonviolence. I like to tell people that if we look around at the movement of movements, right? These are the movements for environmental justice, the movements for racial justice, the movements for economic justice, the movements to stop war, and so forth and so on, the movements for gender justice and sexuality justice and all of that. You very rarely, and I would almost say never, see a social justice movement that is actually advancing violence or a form of violence as a solution to our problems. Right? Think about that for a minute. It's very rare or even never happens that people are proposing that more violence is going to solve our problems. So what we see is that millions of people are actively campaigning for nonviolent solutions to the problems of violence that we see in our world. So this year, Campaign Nonviolence and Pachi Bene launched a poster series as an organizing tool We called this our Nonviolence Means poster series, and can see some of them up on the wall behind me. And the goal with it was really to start to get people thinking about what is nonviolence. Nonviolence can be a personal practice. It can be an interpersonal set of practices. It's a set of tools for making social change. But as we've been talking, it's also something that is systemic and structural. And that's what our poster series tries to uplift. So we talk about cultural shifts and policy shifts, things like everyone is welcome here, migrants and immigrants and more, right? Because one of the major forms of violence is we're seeing in our country right now is exclusion and discrimination towards migrants and immigrants, asylum seekers and refugees. Of course, waging peace, not war. We assert this as a form of nonviolence because it's not just about stopping wars. We know now that in order to stop war and militarism, we actually have to wage peace. We have to train people in the skills of peace. We have to popularize the understanding that peace is literally possible and that doesn't just magically happen. It occurs when a whole bunch of different sorts of practices, policies, systems, and structures are in place that make it harder to go to war and easier to work out our problems in another way. War and violence are actually just forms of conflict management. That's all they really are. And when you understand them as that, you understand that we also have a choice. We could choose a different form and a different way of addressing the conflicts that we have around the world, here in our own nation, even in our schools, communities, or homes. So we also assert that nonviolence means racial justice, not systemic racism. We spoke about that a little bit already. But when you recognize that when we have systems and structures that cause harm to people based on the color of their skin and their race, then we are institutionalizing forms of violence throughout our society. So the converse is dismantling racism, and that is an expression of nonviolence in our society. We could say no guns, we could say, no knives. These are tall orders. Imagining a world beyond guns is almost beyond the scope of our imagination, but it's important to stretch our minds to see that, or we will never actually get there as human beings. In this time of climate crisis, we recognize that violence towards the earth is rapidly becoming one of the most dangerous threats to humanity. That it's not just that we're destroying the earth at large, we are destroying the potential for our species to be present on this planet. And so, we say build windmills, not weapons. We could say build solar panels. We could say reduce our energy use. We could say live lightly on the planet. A lot of things could go in this framework. But in this particular short poster, we just mentioned building windmills, not weapons, right? We need to divest from the practices of war and violence and invest in the practices of nonviolence and of peace. And that includes nonviolence towards the earth. We're starting to see more people talk about healing trauma, and this is really, really critical because we live in a traumatized society, and we know that the traumas that people carry often cause them to lash out and repeat the cycle of trauma and violence. So healing trauma and healing this, many hundreds year long cycles of inflicting violence and trauma on other people is part of building that culture of active nonviolence. We've been working, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on when we talk about Nonviolent Cities. We've been working with Robin Wildman and the Nonviolent Schools Project to popularize the idea that right now, the status quo in our school systems often trains people to normalize violence or to simply have a lack of awareness of the skills and practices they need to not engage in violence. Right? If our culture is constantly teaching us violence, then the school systems, either by default or by active participation, are part of that. And with Campaign Nonviolence, we seek to actually challenge that worldview and insert a whole different way of dealing with conflict in the classroom, dealing with the justice system in the schools, switching to restorative justice, teaching kids de-escalation skills for when conflicts rise to the point of violence, and to walk that back with peer-to-peer conflict mediation, to practice the skills that we know create a more nonviolent world, to start to talk about what nonviolence is in history and literature, looking at the plots of the books that we're taught to study in our literature classes, and say, what of these is normalizing violence? And can we normalize nonviolence instead? Very exciting work going on there. And then last, but certainly not least, this is simply last in terms of our poster series right now, is building cultures of inclusion and understanding, ending sexism and homophobia, and that long list of isms that we could mention here. When people don't feel welcomed, when they don't feel like who they are is a beautiful gift to society, then we are living in a culture of violence. And we challenge that at Campaign Nonviolence. So I just wanted to share, I'll put in the chat box the link to this poster series. One of the wonderful things about it is that it's actually designed to be a free downloadable poster series. Here you go, I'll put it in that chat box. Nonviolence Means is the name of the series. So you can go to this link, you can click on it, you can find all those posters, and you can find a little bit more text about why these are all forms of nonviolence. And you can also download these posters. You can put them up in your home, behind you in your Zoom rooms. You can put them in your local coffee shop if you'd like. We have a lot of people this week during Action Week who have actually printed these out and turned them into posters that they're holding on the street corners, at their peace vigils, that they're using them in their Zoom webinars, just like we just did. And we're very happy to see this because we think it's a really important teaching tool. So please take advantage of it. You can put them up on social media. If you go to our Campaign Nonviolence Facebook page or Twitter account, you'll find the posters. We are posting one each day and you can share them from there. So I just want to say that we see the work of defining and articulating what nonviolence is as essential to not just building a culture of active nonviolence, but also advancing peace. And because it is the International Day of Peace, I just want to mention that peace and nonviolence go together hand in hand. And before I say that, I'll answer Leo's question in the chat box. You didn't get those poster links, so here you go. Let me just pop that out to everyone. Thanks, Leo. Thanks for that note. All right, so back to that point about how peace and nonviolence go hand in hand. We know that, as Gandhi said, means are ends in the making. And to us, we understand that nonviolence gives us the tools to wage peace, to literally wage peace. That peace work and nonviolence kind of overlap very deeply. We've all seen those Venn diagrams with just a little bit of overlap. Peace and nonviolence almost completely overlap. And there are a few distinctions in the practices that are kind of minor distinctions. But what we see around the world is that places and societies that teach nonviolent action and nonviolent struggle specifically are more likely to resolve their major conflicts in their society using nonviolent means. And many of us have started to get to know the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen. In 2011, they actually studied 3 types of campaigns, so 326 case studies of people around the world in the last 100 years who have chosen to change their governmental regime. So sometimes getting rid of dictators, getting rid of corrupt government regimes, or they're trying to end an occupation, or they're trying to expel a foreign invader. So these are pretty big goals. These are the kind of things that usually we call upon our military to do for us. But in these cases, for a variety of reasons, when they looked at an equal number of case studies of people waging these campaigns with violence versus nonviolence, what they found was that not only was nonviolence being used, not only was it working, it was actually working twice as often as violence. Think about that. So to get rid of a dictator, nonviolent struggle is twice as successful as violence. To end an occupation, nonviolent action was twice as successful as mobilizing an armed group to try to get rid of them. To repel a foreign invasion, same thing. But not only that, it was working in a third of the amount of time and with a fraction of the casualties. So this dispels three major myths that plague those of us who promote nonviolence. What we hear all the time is that A, nonviolence doesn't work, B, that nonviolence is slow, it doesn't work fast enough, and C, that everybody's just going to get themselves killed. Well, in reality, those three descriptors actually fit much better for violence than they do for nonviolence. So what we have to remember is that this is a game changer in terms of things like national security, in terms of like how we defend our countries, in terms of how we get rid of dictators or coupists. Because we now have evidence that nonviolent struggle, things like boycotts, strikes, occupations, blockades, shutdowns, sit-ins, civil disobedience, protests, demonstrations, rallies, marches, work far better than actually organizing an army or an air force or what have you. This is pretty groundbreaking. And today is International Day of Peace, so I think it's very important to talk about that, to really grapple with the fact that we now know that there's a better way to go about solving some major conflicts. And in fact, when we look around at global conflict, we see that while certain types of conflicts have increased, civil wars have actually decreased. And one of the reasons that researchers posit is because nonviolent struggles are replacing many of those civil wars. Isn't that profound? Isn't that incredible to think about that change happening around the globe, and that nonviolent struggle is actually one of the great preventers of war while at the same time advancing justice struggles. So we talked about those three kinds of major conflicts, but we have to remember that nonviolence is also being used for a whole bunch of other reasons, things like racial justice, environmental justice, having minority groups stand up for their rights, economic justice. And if you think about those types of campaigns, first of all, it's profound that those types of groups and individuals are choosing to use nonviolent means almost as an automatic default. When we look at racial justice struggles over and over again, even if they don't call what they're doing nonviolence, they are using predominantly nonviolent mechanisms. When we look at labor struggles, the go-to mechanism of a labor struggle for the past 100 years has been the strike, sometimes paired with boycott or picket line, but the strike is usually one of the great agents of change in that. And those have overwhelmingly been using that nonviolent mechanism. So what we're seeing is that if people didn't have these tools, if they didn't have strikes, if they didn't have boycotts, protests, demonstrations, civil disobedience, what would they then choose to wage those struggles? Well, they may choose passivity or inaction, continuing to just try to survive the injustice, or they may choose violence. So when we have people choosing nonviolent tools, they are actively also not choosing A, to comply with the violence through passivity, or B, to replicate the violence by using armed struggle to try to end the injustices that they're facing. This is a profound understanding of the world, to recognize that every time that a movement or campaign for justice chooses a nonviolent action as their tool of struggle, they are taking an act for peace, right? So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also brought us the understanding of negative peace and positive peace. And this is important because honestly, sometimes when nonviolent struggles happen, they don't feel particularly peaceful. In fact, they often feel very tumultuous, very challenging, very difficult. They certainly don't seem quiet. So Dr. King, in the midst of the civil rights movement, started to talk a little bit about negative peace. And this is when everything on the surface seems peaceful and quiet and pleasant and nice. But just beneath the surface of that, we see injustice and oppression, racism, discrimination, exploitation of workers, subjugation of women, whatever it is. And he called this negative peace because while it seems peaceful on the surface, it requires things that are very much not peaceful or respectful or fair or just under the surface. And so Dr. King was always in search of that something called positive peace, a peace rooted in justice. And he argued that even the most tumultuous protest movement is more peaceful than maintaining the status quo of a negative peace. What a profound thing to reflect on in our society, that even a loud, raucous, in-your-face protest movement is stepping into the true meaning of peace more deeply than, continuing to be nice and polite in a society full of injustice and oppression and exploitation. So in that spirit, when we look at movements around the world and recognize that they are moving towards positive peace, they're using nonviolent means to nonviolent ends, then you start to see that we are in a time of immense change. And in fact, the arc of this timeline is over 100 years long. I mean, it's multiple hundreds of years long, where movement after movement of people around the world have stood up over and over and over again to use nonviolent struggle to advance goals that are in alignment with a positive peace. I think that nonviolence is actually the greatest contribution by humankind to humankind, perhaps possibly ever in the history of humankind. We know that nonviolence is actually very old, that the first recorded strike in human history happened in 1170 BC, when pyramid builders went on strike because the pharaoh wasn't actually paying their wages. We know that nonviolence and nonviolent struggle happens around the world in every single kind of culture that you can imagine. It's being done by women, men, people defining gender differently. It's being done by young people, old people, intergenerational movements. It's being done by people of every faith, every political persuasion. And that over 300 different methods of nonviolent struggle alone. And that doesn't even count what we might call nonviolent practices, nonviolent skills, and nonviolent policies, nonviolent solutions. That's a whole other kind of a category. So on this day of International Day of Peace, I think it's important to acknowledge the contributions of a field of change making and solutions that move us towards peace in profound ways in our society, that uproot that kind of negative peace and build step by step, movement by movement, campaign by campaign, the positive peace that we're seeking. This is the work that Campaign Nonviolence tries to do in the world. It's very broad, it's very deep, it's very wide. I find it personally very inspiring to start to connect the dots and pull together all these different strands of this remarkable approach to transforming society. And this week, as we have tens of thousands of people engaged in 4,391 different types of actions all across the country and around the world, I feel a lot of hope. It really heartens me at a time when we see a lot of division in our world, when we face a lot of crises in our world, to remember and see that people believe in peace in a profound and deep way. People believe in and are using nonviolence as a means to that end. So I want to talk a little bit about the year-round work that Pachi Ibene does through our Nonviolent Cities program. And if you wish to leave a comment in the chat box, please go ahead. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat box. If you're watching on Facebook, you can go ahead and put it in the comment section. I'm sure some of our friends here from We the World can get that over into the chat box that I'm looking at right now. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the work that we do, the role that nonviolence plays in the world, what some of these nonviolent solutions are, or nonviolent tactics. To me, they're so deeply entwined, nonviolence and peace, that when we talk about one, we need to be having conversations about the other as well. So let me pull up the next thing here. Several years ago, those of us who work for Pachi Ibene heard about a program in Carbondale, Illinois, where a group of people had gone to their local public library and said, will you host a special program? We want to imagine and build a nonviolent Carbondale, Illinois. We want to take all these ideas of structural and systemic nonviolence, practices of nonviolence, and start to promote them as a civic campaign in our city. And from this was born the Nonviolent Cities project, because when we heard about that, we thought we would love to share this story and to tell people what's going on in Carbondale and encourage them to actually start to dream and imagine their own city as a nonviolent city. And so the Nonviolent Cities project reaches out across the country, and it strives to, first of all, foster a culture of nonviolence through nonviolence trainings, through visual art, things like getting up public murals in neighborhoods, through celebrations or public events, through gatherings, through movie reviews, through teaching nonviolence in the schools, all of these kind of things. To, as we were saying earlier, challenge all the places that a culture of violence usually promotes itself or glorifies itself or claims itself as the one and only way to go about solving conflicts. A nonviolent city challenges that and advances the idea and the notion that there are other ways to solve our conflicts, and that can look like nonviolence. Each of the cities that you see in these slides are actually one of our Nonviolent Cities projects. It does not mean that they are already 100% nonviolent. It means that they are committed as groups of people to pushing their city in the nonviolent direction. So right now you're looking at Nonviolent Morro Bay, and they've done a lot of work with their unhoused population, intervening when the police are going to raid camps. They've also they're doing an interesting project right now with a youth-led booklet on reducing relationship violence, getting that popularized and creating opportunities for the youth to actually teach in the schools how to stop and intervene in relationship violence. So other things that our Nonviolent Cities work on is those nonviolent solutions, hearing about them, learning about them, and advancing them in their city. Things like affordable housing, living wages, and restorative justice. There's a number of these solutions that have already been tested in the world and have pretty great track records. So why aren't we replicating them everywhere? right? So this is one of the things that Nonviolent Cities work on. They also work to dismantle the ways that racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression show up in our cities, and conversely, to build respectful and inclusive cultures. This may be at university campuses, it may be in religious and faith centers, it could be in businesses, it could be with city policies, it could be on public transit. There are many places where people can intervene in the ways that these manifest in our world. And a nonviolent city seeks to identify where are these forms of violence occurring in our city and how can we intervene and transform them. They also look a little bit at where their city is investing their city tax dollars, particularly in endowments and funds, institutional investments, and also major private equity holders who may be residing in their city. And they try to get them to divest from multiple forms of violence, including weapons, private prisons, and fossil fuels. Those are the kind of the three big ones right now, although that list does vary from city to city and expand in some places. This is important. We know from climate justice campaigns that if we want to address the climate crisis, we need to move the money out of it. We need to divest those funds that are going into fossil fuels and weapons, for that matter, nuclear weapons included. That may be coming from cities, they may be coming from universities, are often major locations where divestment campaigns take place. And then, of course, private funds or retirement funds. So we also look at nonviolent cities at ways to train families and individuals in interpersonal nonviolence. So again, those skills by which we choose to resolve our conflicts differently. Some of them are verbal skills, some of them are de-escalation skills, which can be verbal or the use of body language or a way of being in a space that calms things down, that pulls down the energy that is steamrolling towards violence. And then again, working to end domestic violence and relationship violence, as the young people in Morro Bay were doing. We also encourage people to address the ways that their city and the residents of the city participate in or suffer from or perpetrate environmental harm. We ask them to campaign and work for renewable energy and to uphold clean air and water policies and end environmental racism. We often find that multiple forms of violence are entwined together, right? And Twin Cities Nonviolent is doing some great work, not around this specifically, but one of the things I want to uplift that they are doing is they have actually managed to replace cops that were going to be hired in one of the schools as a form of security with a group of young people from the neighborhood who had some previous encounters or troubles with the law. They trained them with Nonviolent Peace Force, which does unarmed peacekeeping around the world and is now doing more domestic work. They trained them in the skills of unarmed peacekeeping, and then they got them jobs in the local schools. So every day, these young people show up at the school. First, they do a perimeter check. This particular school they're working at happens to be fairly close to a drug dealing corner. So they go and ask those who are participating in that to move away from the school during school hours. They escort the teachers and the young people into the school so they feel safe and accompanied. They help the students deal with their conflicts in the classroom. And then they escort them out of the school into the school buses on the way home. I think this is a beautiful program and such a great example of how the skills of peace and unarmed peacekeeping can be reducing violence and ending injustices in our towns and cities right now. So in a related way, because we know we have challenges with this in the United States, a nonviolent city works to end police brutality and redirect funds that are going towards militarizing the police and get those funds pointed towards social responders and nonviolent alternatives to policing. There's a number of these examples all over the country. They have actually a really good track record. Many of them have been reducing gun violence from 30 to 50%. In, I would say I've heard about a dozen or more cities have this track record. And this is the kind of thing that we need to have implemented everywhere. And nonviolent cities work to do that. Last but certainly not least, nonviolent cities work to build and popularize the skills of using nonviolent action as a tool for social, cultural, and political change. As we've been talking, every time we choose to use nonviolent action, it's an act of peace as well, because we have actively chosen not to pick up violence and start another kind of war in our society. And instead, we've chosen to move out of negative peace towards positive peace, using nonviolence as our means to an end, and our means and our ends in the making. So I'm going to stop the screen share right here for a moment. That is the Nonviolent Cities program. And there's so many amazing things that people are doing in large and small ways. I'll give you our most recent update of what's happening with Nonviolent Cities. I'm going to pop that in the chat box. And here you'll find ways that people are organizing small projects that are very specifically targeted to address a particular kind of violence in their area. We have I think we have 25 active nonviolent city groups. And some of them are doing things like building participation in nonviolent campaigns like the March for Democracy or the Poor People's Campaign. Some of them are training people in nonviolence curriculums. Some of them are working to divest city funds. Others have anti-racism efforts going that are accompanying the replacement of racist statues with, in this particular example in Prescott, Arizona, a statue of Harriet Tubman. We have people working on building nonviolent schools and so much more. So I just want to also share with you in the chat box the link from the program in Minneapolis. I think that's one of the great examples of nonviolent city, and I would love to see that popularized more in other places. So I feel like I've been talking in a whirlwind about all these wonderful programs and projects that Pachi Bene and Campaign Nonviolence are doing. And I'm just going to pause and check the chat box and see if there's any questions from people, comments, things that really want to be said at this moment. Great. Well, don't be shy about getting those in there. One of the things that we do a lot of at Pachi Bene is we try to connect the dots between the issues as we've been talking about today, but we also try to illuminate that nonviolence is really a threefold practice. And we could say peace, building peace is a threefold practice as well. You need to practice nonviolence or peace towards yourself. You need to practice nonviolence and peace towards all others. And you need to practice nonviolence and peace towards the whole world. And that may seem like a very tall order. But when we start with ourselves and we practice with one another, it's a continuum right up through the work that we do out in the world. And certainly, I'm sure many of us have run into examples where those who are advocating for peace or nonviolence in the world or engaged in nonviolent action campaigns have maybe lost sight of how to practice those things towards themselves. When we do that, we become less effective as change makers in our world. And so at Pachi Bene, we try to make sure that we're working on all three of those. And so that we're learning the skills to live in greater alignment with ourselves and one another. So practices of nonviolence towards yourself may be things like knowing when to take a break, right? Hearing the ways that you judge or critique yourself harshly, not constructively, but harshly, and interrupting that cycle in your own head, right? The ways that we can cause abuse to ourselves, and that list can be quite long. So actively working on stopping those cycles within yourself, doing some of that trauma healing work if you're a person who carries trauma. And as we're doing that work, to think about what are the ways in which we pass on violence with our friends, our coworkers, maybe our colleagues in the field that we work in, our fellow activists, and how can we start to dismantle those practices that we may be unwittingly or intentionally engaging in. And certainly things like nonviolent communication is one of many practices that you can use, maybe deep listening or active listening, empathy practices, to start to practice nonviolence and build peace within your relationships with other people. There are also skills of conflict navigation that we can all learn with great humility, right? Because since we live in a culture of violence, one of the things that happens because of this is we don't learn the skills of handling conflict without war and violence, right? If you think about the movies that we watch, but just use movies as an example. So many times we see violence promoted as a solution to the problem, right? Just kill the bad guy, grab the girl, and ride off into the sunset. But far less often do we see a movie portray the plot as, okay, the way to solve this problem is to sit down and have an empathy circle, or to do a little act of peace building and repair the relationships that we might have blown up in the first part of the movie, or have a nonviolent campaign with a boycott and a strike to stop this person who's been abusive to our community. Or instead of having a whole war over something, to actually wage peace instead, right? If you just think about the violence that we see in the movies and the stories that we tell in our movies, you start to understand how this culture of violence perpetuates itself and starts to promote itself as the only answer to our problems. So when it gets down to how we handle conflicts with our friends and our coworkers, is it any wonder that so many of us are just reaching and replicating for the ways that we've seen violence practiced in our world? So if we want a culture of peace and nonviolence, we have to actively, as individuals and collectively, learn other ways to handle conflicts, right? Large scale conflicts, small scale conflicts, whatever it is. And the micro can be the practice for the macro. And those of us who work for peace on the national or international level, we see this all the time. And one of the places I see it most is around national security. There is a primary assumption, particularly in the United States, that security only comes from military, right? That we have to give the military so many tax dollars. We need to have so many people recruited into the military every year. We need to be on active alert everywhere in the whole country because that's what makes us secure. And that is the only thing that makes us secure. So I would say that, that's a myth, first of all. It's not necessarily even making us secure, all of that. So that is a place where the culture of violence has said, we are the only way that you can be secure as a nation. But those of us who work with peace and for peace have seen with our own eyes that security is rooted in justice, honestly. Security is rooted in advancing the well-being of everyone, of making sure human needs are met, of making sure that longstanding injustices are addressed, not perpetuated, and that we can advance a sense of national security through actually building peace with other countries instead of, trying to dominate them or terrify them with our military might. So this is why at Campaign Nonviolence, we really think about how can we disrupt this culture of violence and the war culture, because otherwise it's a self-fulfilling perpetual cycle. It will always keep doing that same thing over and over again. It will justify itself. It will agitate to the point of violence and war, and it will not have the skills to walk back from that point and to wage and build and establish peace. So the whole thing is tied together. It's all interconnected. And when we start to work for justice in a way that builds peace and build peace in a way that's rooted in justice, then we can actually transform our society in a profound way. And while we can acknowledge that our country, the United States, and the world has so many problems with violence and war, I think it's also important to acknowledge and to recognize that at the same time, we've never had so much movement, action, campaigns, practices, policies, and solutions that are all expressing themselves as nonviolent solutions. We've never been in a better place to wage this campaign. And indeed, at Campaign Nonviolence, this is what we've seen year after year, is that the campaign and the action week have grown year after year from when we started back in the early days with a couple hundred to 1,000 actions to today, where we have 4,391 actions and events happening right now the week to build this culture of peace and active nonviolence, free from war, poverty, racism, and environmental destruction. What we're seeing is that the world is hungry for nonviolent solutions, and these nonviolent solutions themselves have decades of track records behind them. And just like nonviolent struggle is showing itself to be twice as effective, fast, and safe compared to violent means, the nonviolent solutions also have tremendously positive outcomes, good proof and evidence that they work. And what they really need right now is not necessarily more evidence and facts, but more popularizing and applications. And that is the work that we try to do at Pachi Bene with Campaign Nonviolence, with our year-round educational program, and with the Nonviolent Cities project. So this culture of nonviolence is entirely possible. It's on the cusp of really breaking through public consciousness. The more of us who can articulate it, express it, understand it, know what we mean when we say nonviolence, know the practical tools of peace, how peace actually gets built, how unarmed peacekeeping and peace teams can help interrupt and diffuse violence, walking it back to the point where our conflicts can be dealt with in another way. Those of us who can stand up to the ways that the culture of violence replicates itself, or the ways that militarism and war perpetuate their primary position in our sense of security and well-being. These are all aspects and component of an ever-growing movement that is literally transforming our world. I think we often forget how vast and broad the change in our society is around how we wage struggle. While nonviolent struggle has a very long history, we also know that in the last 100 years, it has been exponentially increasing in its use, in its frequency, in the size, scope, and breadth of what's been happening, and even in its efficacy and its success rate. So when we look at something like in the past 2 years alone, both the United States have seen its largest protests ever with the George Floyd protests in 2020, 97% of which were entirely nonviolent and quote unquote peaceful. Largest protests in US history, 20 million people But that's not all that's happened in the past year or past 2 years. India set a world record for the largest protest movement in human history, 100 million people. And then in 2020, even amidst the pandemic, they broke that record and had even more people taking action. This is a trend that we're seeing around the world, that nonviolence is escalating in its frequency, size, and scope. And I think it's because of moments like this, programs like this. Thank you, We the World, for putting together not just this talk and seminar, but also all the ones that you've hosted this week that are helping people connect to the solutions, the new knowledge and reports that are coming out, the scope and sense of vision of what people who are working for nonviolence and peace are doing. And really helping to popularize the understanding that the work that we do is practical, effective, viable, tangible, tactile, useful for our communities and ourselves, and indeed the entire world. So as you're going about the International Day of Peace, I hope you feel a little bit more heartened to remember what's going on the positive side of things, what it really means to wage peace, and what it means to build this culture of active nonviolence. I'm just going to put into the chat box one more link, which is to our Campaign Nonviolence Action Week. You can find everything that's happening around the country, or across the country and around the world, from September 18th through 26th. You'll find it in a way that you can search through it for what's happening in your local area. You can also look and see what's happening each day. We'll be going on for several more days, and then there's a few things that kind of happen after the week of actions that we still count because they're really wonderful events. So thank you for having me with you here today. I'm really honored to be part of it. Campaign Nonviolence and Pachi Bene have been collaborating with We the World we were trying to count the years before we got into this call, but it's at least 5 or 6 years and probably more. This is the kind of collaboration that enlivens the movement and makes us feel like we're not so alone. So thank you all so much. Have a beautiful day, and that is all for now.